Hey guys, this is Eckhartsladder. Hello and welcome to another episode of Star Wars Fleet Academy. This has got to be my favorite series on the channel right now because I get to talk about stuff that usually is relegated to the lore channel, Eckhartsladder, over here on EcksToo. It's sort of a fun melding of my two different channels and I just really enjoy it. Basically, the goal of this series is to help you guys get better at Star Wars games, mostly Empire at War up until this point, using real information from the Star Wars expanded universe, both legends and canon. So far we've done videos on how to use Thrawn's tactics and strategies to win not only Empire at War battles, but also larger campaigns. We've covered real starfighter tactics that you can use in Star Wars Squadrons when that releases, and how to beat much larger fleets in Empire at War, even if you are outnumbered. Today, however, we will be covering the basics of fleet management, and that's everything from fleet composition to positioning to actually slugging it out in battle. This will be a good foundational episode, I think, and one that you should definitely pay attention to if you are new to Empire at War and if you're new to Star Wars ships, how these different classes operate, which ship is meant to do what, who you should be targeting, where your ship should be, etc, etc. So a lot of the information from today's video comes from the excellent but also quite old RPG guide from West End Games called the Rebel Alliance Sourcebook. So with that in mind, I thought it'd be fun if we did some battles today in Awakening of the Rebellion. However, before we jump into anything, before we get into even the basics of fleet composition or management, we need to talk terminology just because I want to make sure we're all on the same page. Now, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. I'm assuming you guys have some knowledge of Star Wars. If you don't, however, just look anything up on the Wikipedia that you don't understand. So let's talk about the ships you'll be using in most battles, or at least some battles. And the smallest ship, not a capital ship, but the next size down, is a starfighter. You guys all know what starfighters are. They're very small, they're very fast. They come in different classes, from heavy bombers and bombers to interceptors and all-purpose fighters, and generally they'll either be defending your large capital ships or attacking your enemies. On the next size up, we have sort of a rare class, definitely the rarest of the ones we'll be discussing today. That's the fast attack vessels, and that's something like an IPV or a Brawl. Basically, these are slightly larger than starfighters, but not quite freighters even, or corvettes. Heavier than starfighters, a little more armor and weaponry, but not nearly as fast. Usually, the book recommends that these be kept in picket formation or within your fleet to protect against starfighters. Because of their slower speed and less maneuverability, you probably don't want to put these things on the offensive. They'll get blasted out of space by a turbo laser pretty quickly. Next up in size, we have things like corvettes, and the most famous corvette would be the CR-90. I think the Alliance Sourcebook says that corvettes are usually heavily armed enough to take on starfighters and at least annoy frigates and cruisers. Corvettes usually are quite maneuverable and are usually used in an anti-starfighter role. Sometimes they'll have only laser cannons, so they'll be good at taking out starfighters. Sometimes there'll be a few turbo lasers thrown on there, but just generally corvettes are not meant for duking it out with large ships. The next size up would be frigates. We're talking everything from a Nebulon B to an assault frigate. These are usually even more multi-role ships. Frigates will typically have some anti-starfighter weapons, but will also have turbo lasers and missiles and torpedoes meant for taking on other frigates and helping to fight cruisers. So basically, they'll be supporting the larger ships, not only in helping against starfighters, but also in providing a little bit of offensive upside at the cost, of course, of less speed and maneuverability compared to a corvette. Then the final class we have here is cruisers, and I know some of you are thinking, well, what about battle cruisers or dreadnoughts? Well, just ignore those delineations today, because a cruiser, for the purposes of this discussion, is basically any ship meant primarily to fight other cruisers. Cruisers are the backbone of any fleet. Their focus is blowing up larger craft, and usually the side which runs out of cruisers first is the one that loses a battle, because if a cruiser is undefended against, it can usually just ravage any other ships in the enemy fleet, at least with some exceptions. The trade-off usually is that cruisers aren't very good at fighting off against starfighters, for example, so they need to be supported by a variety of other ships. And that's really a good way to think about the different capital ship classes. We have cruisers, your main offensive potential, you have support ships, and then arguably you have starfighters as a distinctive third entity. So when it comes to fleet fleet composition, i.e. which ships will make up your fleet, there are no hard rules, and really a lot will depend on which Empire at War module you're playing, what kind of enemy you're fighting, what their fleets look like, and of course what you have available. Basically though, you want to maximize the amount of firepower that you can bring into battle, so you want to maximize the amount of cruisers you can bring in while still properly supporting them. The Alliance Sourcebook actually has a really good diagram of an Alliance fleet battle line, and although it's not a necessary requirement, this isn't the ratio of ships needed, it is a pretty good representation. We see cruisers flanked by close support vessels including frigates and corvettes, then we see an outer line of picket ships and starfighters. Let's break down what this all means. So cruisers are cruisers, we've talked a lot about them. I'll read what the book says about close support vessels. The battle line's frigates act as close support vessels to the cruisers. They are assigned to engage the enemy's frigates and starfighters within the kill or secondary zone. We'll come back to that in a minute, by the way. They are not allowed to enter the line's primary zone for fear of collision with the cruisers. I'd say that doesn't necessarily have to be your approach in Empire at War, but as the battle develops and you gain an advantage or disadvantage, some or all of these craft may switch from the defensive to the offensive, launching their own attacks against enemy smaller ships or seeking to penetrate the enemy battle line's primary zone. Starfighter escorts roam around within the fleet, protecting the cruisers from any fighter incursions, while attack fighters obviously try to take on enemy ships, sort of as another offensive arm of your fleet. When it comes to actual positioning, you're sort of in a catch-22 when it comes to smaller ships, because they need to be close enough to your main ships to offer protection against starfighters, but that also puts them in a sort of hot zone for the enemy's turbo lasers. A lot of this comes down to identifying the zones of battle and looking at ranges. Typically, very large ships, like cruisers, will have better range than frigates and corvettes. The Alliance Sourcebook says that the long engagement zone is where your cruisers can start actually hitting some targets, and typically if you can at this point, you want to actually start picking off weaker ships that you only have to hit a few times, things like corvettes. They can't fight back, and as you can actually bring more weapons to bear in what's called the kill zone, you want to bring the majority of your weapons onto the enemy cruisers. So one viable strategy is to give some range between your fleet and the enemy fleet. Place your cruisers up front, keep your support ships back a little bit. If they need to move up to try to intercept some fighters, so be it. But until then, continue to test the enemy with long-range barrages, and if you have a starfighter advantage, definitely take that. If you can really hit the enemy fleet before your capital ships even get in range, well, you've already came close to winning the battle. As the fleets converge into a primary and secondary zone, fighters become more effective. However, one of the main problems here is that fighters will often move independently from their larger ships. So although large capital ships might still just be at the edge of their range, fighters may be in their primary zone and ready to drop bombs. So identifying ranges and what your enemy is targeting is really crucial. You really want to get a distinct advantage when it comes to cruisers or starfighters. Much of this will come down into goading the enemy into attacking you in a way that they really shouldn't and winning the rock, paper, scissors battle of corvettes, fighters, and cruisers. One strategy that will sometimes work is what people often call kiting. If you can send ships up and then retreat them back into your battle line, sometimes the enemy will recklessly send fighters down to chase you. You take advantage of this by bringing your corvettes into the fray and just knocking the fighters out right there, and then immediately you have an advantage that you didn't a second earlier. And that's why composition is so important. If you play Awakening of the Rebellion and you're the Empire and you do not have corvettes or carriers protecting your cruisers, you're simply going to be in trouble. The Alliance will just dominate you with X-Wings and Y-Wings, which is why you need to support your capital ships. And you gotta think about in battle how you can protect against and exploit these sort of vulnerabilities. So we've talked a bit about how you should micromanage ships during fleet battles. These various line formations do work. Personally, I prefer a horizontal line rather than a vertical one, just because it allows both ships to get in range at the same point, and because EAW pathfinding is a little bit messy. By both ships, I mean both cruisers. I really like the idea of picking off corvettes at long range, but when cruisers and frigates enter the kill range, range, I do think it's important to send the majority of your firepower towards their cruisers, because the second you get even a one-ship advantage, it can be battle over. There are, of course, exceptions. If they have one Corvette that's protecting a capital ship, well, take a second and take it out if you have bombers on the way. When it comes to micromanaging frigates, I do like to use them mostly in an anti-starfighter role. However, should I find myself at a disadvantage and start seeing my cruisers lose out to their cruisers, that's when your frigates can jump in an anti-capital ship role. And assault frigates, for example, work like this quite well. They have the maneuverability to attack an enemy from a bad position, they can break the battle line, they can deliver firepower, and they can even do so somewhat self-sufficiently because most frigates will have some form of anti-starfighter. However, if you do break the battle line, there is a very high likelihood that that frigate is not coming home with you. I often like to use wolfpack tactics or group attacks with frigates. This is something I find works really well in Thrawn's Revenge, for example. So if the enemy has pierced my battle line, or if we're just slugging it out, I'll select 4 or 5 frigates in one place, have them maneuver out of the battle line and attack one enemy. Now, this is knowing that they might die, but also knowing that it's probably better to lose a couple of frigates than a single cruiser. When it comes to Corvettes, generally I try to keep them out of range of enemy cruisers. I keep them like halfway back behind a cruiser, and then when fighters move in, I'll move them up to engage as well. And the interesting thing is, by the time the two battle lines have fully engaged each other, usually the cruisers will be so focused on slamming each other that you can actually operate the Corvettes around the battlefield pretty freely. So if you even want to have your Corvette helping to take out their defensive starfighters, so your bombers or your attacking fighters can take out their cruisers, I think at some point that becomes a viable situation. The Alliance sourcebook calls the general breaking of a battle line a brawl, which is what we saw, for example, at the Battle of Endor, but I think if your cruisers maintain position and you're simply allowing your frigates or your Corvettes to break, as long as you're still supporting the ships somewhat, I wouldn't consider that to be a brawl. The brawl has negative connotations associated with it, mostly that the winner will simply be the luckier commander, but I don't know, your mileage may vary. On a practical, less lore-focused approach, I do find the line formation works very, very well in Empire at War, especially because the enemy often will rush your line with individual ships. So basically, you can focus all of your cruiser firepower and even your starfighters on a single target. However, especially when fighting ships like Star Destroyers and using hyperspace jumps and whatever else, it is worth noting that sometimes it's worth breaking the line if it means you can attack a ship from the rear, or you can attack a Star Destroyer from somewhere that their firing arc doesn't cover. So if there's one thing to take away from this video, I think it's that the cruiser is the backbone of pretty much every fleet. However, the effectiveness of a cruiser relies not only on those ships themselves, but also on the number and positioning of the ships supporting the cruiser. Tactically, decisions like whether the frigate should continue to focus on starfighters or should try to attack enemy capital ships and break the line, or whether you should focus long-range fire on corvettes, will make a huge difference. So pay attention to how you're losing and whether you're actually using your fleets in an organized way. I will also say, picket ships like IPVs or very, very small corvettes can actually work well, especially if they're placed relatively far out of the fleet. Accuracy against them will be significantly lower than against a frigate or a corvette, and they're pretty good at taking out enemy starfighters. So that's one way to dictate the battle that I don't often see a lot of people use. But guys, that's all I have for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure you subscribe for more Fleet Command and check out the playlist. But until next time, guys, this has been Eckhartsladder. Maybe the Force be with you.